Welcome, everyone. We are celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Month with this talk called One House, Many Stories, Chinese Connections. I'm Rowena Saura, Gunston Hall's Collections Management Technician. And I lived as an American expat in Beijing and Guangzhou, known as Peking and Canton, and to the west in the 18th century. So when I first walked into George Mason's dining room, the decoration was somewhat familiar to me. You could see here, this is the west side of the room. Note the beautiful carved decoration that we'll talk about later. And here is the north side of the room. And here is the detail above the fireplace with the hooded or canopied shelf. And so I wondered how these Chinese motifs came to colonial rural Virginia. So I picked up this excellent book by Stacy Sloboda and invited her here to talk with us today. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you so much.
And it's great to be here. Yourself.
So I'm Stacy Sloboda. I am an associate professor and the Paul H. Tucker Professor of Art at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I wrote a book on chinoiserie and am generally interested in 18th century design history, material culture, and cross-cultural connections.
So Stacy, George and Ann Mason's dining room is unique because it's a surviving early example of chinoiserie architecture in America. So my first it's a big question for you today. What is chinoiserie?
Right. So how much time do you have? Chinoiserie, basically, chinoiserie is a decorative style. So it could be in architecture, it could be in ceramics, and other furniture. Sometimes it's in painting, though principally we associate it with decorative forms like the dining room at Gunston Hall. And it's a decorative style that's taking materials or images of China. And that could be actual Chinese motifs, materials and images, or it could be kind of imagined ideas about what someone thought China was in the 18th century. It takes those kinds of images as its subject.
And speaking of taking the images, can you tell us a bit of how these images were spread around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just share my screen with you here. If we look at that, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So here would be a really great example of chinoiserie, which I should say, even though we tend to associate it with European and American style, it really actually is a global style. Anywhere where China traded in the world, we see examples of chinoiserie. So I'm showing you 3 examples, all from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, of Persian chinoiserie, Mexican chinoiserie, and English chinoiserie. And in the dish on the left, you can see in the Persian example, which is from the 17th century, it's quite early, we see Persian artists taking the kind of signature cobalt blue color on a white base to try and imitate Chinese blue and white porcelain, which had really become a global commodity by the 17th century. So they're looking at Chinese blue and white porcelain that was probably exported to them by Chinese and Persian and actually Dutch merchants as well, and adapting specific Chinese motifs. So Rowena, you can see here that the subject is actually an image from a famous Chinese poem, Rhapsody on Red Cliff, where you see a scene where people are having a party in a boat. So this sort of boating party motif was popular in Chinese blue and white export porcelain, taken up in this Persian example. But nobody who spent any time looking at actual Chinese blue and white porcelain would think this was made by a Chinese artist. It's incredibly dense. It's got ornament all over it, all over the rim and the basin. And it has both the scenic motif of the boat and the water topography around it, and then a huge number of symbolic emblems around the edges, much, much, much more highly decorated than one would see in an example of Chinese blue and white porcelain for a Chinese audience. So this is one example of chinoiserie, right? Of a Persian artist taking inspiration from actual Chinese motifs and turning them into something different that references China without actually maybe necessarily representing it, right? And we see similar types of things, I think, in the Mexican and in the famous English blue willow pattern examples as well.
So turning to George and Ann Mason's dining room in particular, George Mason was building this grand home, and he asked his brother, who was studying in England, to look for a carver, to look for a designer to decorate his home and plan his home. And so he turned to an Englishman, an indentured servant named William Buckland, and this was around 1755. And can you talk a little bit about what would have influenced William Buckland and how he was influenced by chinoiserie design?
Yeah, this is such a great story, and I think is one of the reasons chinoiserie is so interesting, is it would have been mainly print sources as well as objects. So Buckland trained in London as a joiner, and in that environment would have been very much exposed to a lot of Chinese objects that were being imported by the English East India Company into London at that time. Almost 100,000 ceramics per year came to London in the time that Buckland was living there. So certainly objects would have been part of it, but really print culture would have been a big part of it. So one of the interesting things that happens in England in the 1740s and 50s is we see the rise of printed design manuals, where you have artists, Thomas Chippendale is one of the most famous today, publishing designs. Not designs that they've never necessarily even made or even ever will make, but designs that for furniture that could be made. So Chippendale, we can, let's go back to my screen and I'll show you an example. Chippendale published a book in 1754, the year before Buckland moved to Virginia, called The Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director. Many of your audience will be familiar with it, I think. And it was a design manual that proposed designs for furniture in the so-called modern, which is what they at the time called the Rococo style, the Gothic style, and the Chinese style. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you an example of one of Chippendale's designs for a ceramics case, for a china case or cabinet. But Chippendale was really just one of many cabinet makers and other artisans who were publishing in London in the 1740s and 50s. William Halfpenny, an architect, would be another example. And it was through these print publications that chinoiserie really was disseminated to places like America. Buckland brought these books with him, or would have had access to them in Virginia, and used them as inspiration. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the dining room at Gunston Hall is not copying any of these designs exactly, but rather acting kind of as a stylistic inspiration for a carver and designer's creativity.
That's right. And I just want to take a moment to tell our audience that please feel free to be a part of this conversation. Write down your thoughts, questions in the comments, and tell us what city you're joining us from. That would be great to know a little bit who you are. And continuing on your thoughts, Stacy, William Buckland did have a copy, a 1754 copy of the Chippendale Director in his inventory. And I just want to share, like, I had so much fun going through the Chippendale Director. And to our audience, the book is available online. Thank you, Smithsonian. So I just want to show you what I found. Well, this one is from William Chambers, and the pagoda design reminded me of the curved details in the dining room. And with the Chippendale Director, the hooded canopied shelves just, echoed a little bit of that same theme.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite feature in the dining room are these I call them fish scales or dragon scales. And I saw in the Chippendale Director examples of some of these. And when I was in China, it's a variable. It's a very popular design I saw everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, we think about like, where would Chippendale have gotten these ideas from? Some from print, but I think mainly from objects, from ceramics, lacquerware, leather, and all sorts of objects where those kinds of motifs, they're identifying them, picking them up. So like the fish scale design, I think, is a really great example of something that can be kind of picked up as a kind of like visual sign of China, something that kind of references China without actually like really being like explicit or picturing it in any particular way. So I think chinoiserie is such a great example of the way different cultures can be in contact with and communicate with one another, even if they're not face to face, right? Like we can learn from one another and be in contact with one another through objects as well as through contact. Yeah.
In fact, at the time, the European exposure to China was very controlled and limited, wasn't it? You couldn't just travel around.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, many European merchants went to Southeast Asia in the 18th century, but particularly in the case of China, almost none of them actually even got off the boat, right? So like they went to the shore of China, but very few of them actually were permitted access even into the kind of coastal merchant areas. And William Chambers, who you just showed, was a great example of that. He, as a young man, went to China twice with the Swedish East India Company. And there's been a lot of scholarly discussion about like what he would have been able to see. My opinion is probably very, very little. He was a low-ranking member of a merchant ship, and typically those people spent almost no time off the actual ship. So when Chambers comes back to Europe, reinvents himself as an architect, and publishes a book in 1757 on Chinese designs and says like, I know about these because I've been there, these are authentic. We really need to take that with a grain of salt, I think.
Right. And thinking about today, taking us back to, we have a question. Could you explain the origin of the word chinoiserie?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So it's not a term that was used in the 18th century. It's a 19th century term that came from the Goncourt brothers, probably, and some other French sources in the 19th century. So it's a 19th century term that really as so many artistic terms and for styles are, started as derogatory terms, it already in the 19th century had kind of associations with being fake, with being kind of excessive, with being kind of illegitimate in some way. The French word chinoiserie has those kinds of associations kind of built into it. In the 18th century, the term that was used in English was the Chinese taste.
Right.
That was the term they used. So yeah, it's a later French term.
And there was a fascination with the idea of China that I think you mentioned to me once about there was an interest in the philosophy. And could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So particularly in the 17th and 18th century, not only was China one of the most populous, but it was also one of those powerful nations and empires in the world, and had an incredibly long, sustained history, and particularly a sustained imperial history. So when European monarchs who largely had been at war with one another and had the kind of condition of European monarchy is one of kind of constant change, even if it's meant to be seen as this kind of continuity. So Europeans were very envious of the Chinese political system, particularly monarchs were. And then, of course, the tremendous amount of technological innovation and the capacity for manufacture that Chinese systems had in the 17th and 18th century was really something that Europe looked at with admiration, with envy, and as a threat. Right. So we see in this kind of pre-imperial moment in the 17th and early 18th century, a kind of political kind of interest and wariness of China on the part of Europeans. But philosophically and culturally, you have a lot of people looking at Chinese philosophy and Chinese art and being absolutely intrigued and amazed by it. So we see a real genuine, I think in many cases, interest in understanding and trying to engage with a culture that seemed, on the one hand, quite different from European culture, and in other ways quite similar, actually. So that's what's happening in the kind of pre-imperial moment. And then we see, I think, from the middle of the 18th century and certainly into the 19th century with imperial clashes between European powers and the Chinese Empire, and the increasingly militaristic and colonial kind of approach that many European nations took towards China, a much more kind of hostile cultural engagement. And that's where I think we really start to see the kind of adoption of chinoiserie into stereotype, right? Into these kinds of ideas of excess and frivolity and kind of, sort of goofy looking kind of orientalized sorts of images. So chinoiserie, I think also kind of like by studying chinoiserie, we can also kind of understand the way cultural contact and understanding can transform into something else, given different kind of political contexts.
And related to that is another great question. Did something happen to bring Chinese designs into fashion? Was there an event which made that happen?
Yeah, and I mean, no one single event, but I think we could credit people like William Chambers, that architect who published a book based on what he said he saw in China, people like Thomas Chippendale and the population of what we would call Chinese Chippendale, which is sometimes the way Gunston Hall's dining room would be described. Publications like that in the middle of the 18th century were, I think, a big kind of design event that brought the style into fashion. And then I think in some ways, like the flexibility of chinoiserie, that it can kind of be, it can look at so many different ways. I mean, you can have wallpaper that's really quite botanical. It really has like nothing in particular to do with Chinese culture, but looks very much like Chinese bird and flower paintings, and motifs that really kind of became associated with European and American culture as well. There's just this continuity. Like chinoiserie, I don't think ever really went out of fashion.
Right. And you mentioned wallpaper, so I just wanted to take a look at that. I have a picture here. So we don't have the original wallpaper in the Gunston Hall dining room, but we did some research and we found that the Winterthur wallpaper would be a good match because, well, it's 18th century English design. We didn't think that it would have come, the wallpaper would have come directly from China because that was a rare export at the time, and it most likely would have come from England. So we painstakingly copied the Winterthur design. And as you can see, the one, the Winterthur one has aged, and ours is newer, of course. But you could see a kind of similarities with Chinese painting, and I pulled some here. You had mentioned, gaining inspiration from Chinese paintings, and I'm proud to say that I found 3 women Chinese artists, Yun Bing, Wen Shu, Jin Yue, to show to us today. And of course, you had also mentioned that, oh, do you have anything else to say about the wallpaper?
No, I think I absolutely echo your point. The hand-painted Chinese wallpaper was one of the most expensive and sought after exports that the European East India companies brought back to Europe. So there's been this kind of revival of like discovering Chinese wallpaper, rolls of this wallpaper that's been hiding in people's attics for a long time, and we're increasingly seeing more and more houses installing examples of hand-painted wallpaper that once existed in those houses. So I'm just delighted to see Gunston Hall's version of it. I think particularly since it's a replica and it's in such good condition, it's so great because it shows us, it gives us a sense of how bright and how profuse the effect would have been in the 18th century. I think we, maybe sometimes think of these as kind of like dark or very kind of like restrained interiors, and the dining hall at Gunston really shows us like how kind of exuberant things like wallpaper could be to like really kind of bring a lot of visual variety to a room.
And it's still being used today, and you have some examples of wallpaper that's used today. Can we see that?
Yeah, sure. I had fun just looking at these as well. So let's go to here. There's Gunston's wallpaper, and so the two, as much as I'm aware, decorators probably know more than I do about this, but 2 firms that are still making very, very high quality hand painted chinoiserie wallpaper, or wallpaper in the Chinese taste, are de Gournay in London, which we see on the left hand side, and Gracie in New York. Here in the middle, very, very expensive, very elite forms of, they're very large scale paintings, essentially hand painted in the same way that they would have been in the 18th century. But wallpaper is so great because it's, it can be this kind of luxury object, but it can also be this kind of popular object. And I found as well the company Temp Paper, who does self-adhesive removable wallpapers and kind of adhesive wall stickers, has this wonderful chinoiserie digitally printed example as well. So this, I think, goes to my point as well. Like chinoiserie has really never gone out of fashion.
Would you
And
mind just going backward to the Gunston Hall dining room, because we had a comment, maybe the person missed the first part where we showed pictures of the dining room. So this is the Gunston Hall dining room.
yeah, which is just spectacular, right? And I love the way that your wallpaper really kind of interacts with the carving as well. I think it was a very smart choice to choose this kind of repeating.
It is very beautiful. It's stunning when you walk in.
Yeah, it's just great.
And I just want to finish by showing the chinoiserie that I found in my search from tattoos, fashion, wallpaper, home decor, and a mask. So it's still very relevant today, and we see it everywhere today. And I encourage our audience to just look around and see it in your life and all around you. And
so go ahead.
So Stacy, I think we need to finish off, but do you have any parting thoughts, or is there anything exciting happening in your life?
Well, one day I'll get out of my house, right? We all will, but it's just been such an honor to visit Gunston remotely in this way. And so my book on chinoiserie was published a couple of years ago, and is available in a few handful of libraries, I believe, around the world. But a lot of scholarly work is being done on this subject now, I think, as art historians try to understand cultures that we used to think were separate from one another and think about them in connection with one another. That's a really exciting aspect of research that a lot of people are focusing on now, and I would like to include myself in that. So so I continue to think about this subject, and I can't wait to visit Virginia and come see the dining room.
Welcome you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out from a busy end of semester. And I hope all of that went well. And to our audience, if you enjoyed this talk, if you learned something from this talk, please think about donating to Gunston Hall at gunstonhall.org. And keep in mind that we have a summer filled with events. We have summer Saturdays coming up in every Saturday in June, July, August, focusing on archaeology, 18th century food, gardens, and games. And also June 12th is coming up, which is Declaration Day, commemoration of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which George Mason authored. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your support. And thanks again, Stacy. And everyone have a great day and a great Asian American Pacific Islander Month.
Thank you, Rowena.
Bye.
Bye-bye.